This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, culture workers, political organizers, and everyone in between, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is between myself and my collaborator on this project, John Drabinski. As colleagues in the Department of African American and Africana Studies at University of Maryland, we share a deep commitment to the field, and in the inaugural conversation of this series, we explore what we find so engaging about the area of study, what is compelling about its past, and what we hope to see as part of its future. Hi, John. It's great to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's good to see you and see you, but we're just recording the audio. But it's nice to have a chance to sort of inaugurate the podcast by, talking between the two of us about our relationship to Black studies. I was thinking as I was getting ready to talk, we're across the hall from each other. We see each other all the time. But these questions about our relationship to Black studies, I actually don't know. So I'm sort of discovering as we talk. This is great. Let me start off and just ask you, how did you get into the field of Black studies? Both what drew you in, but I'm also curious, what drew you in and what keeps you committed to it? Because it's your PhD and also your professional identity. It's where you work in an African American and Africana Studies department. So what drew you in the first place and what keeps you there?
So I had a very roundabout trajectory to Black studies in that I did not know it was a thing until I got to undergrad, and my writing professor was getting his PhD in Black studies. And so I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I was most interested in Black language. And so I got to do some work with that. And then I kind of, because of the language aspect of it, did some education in urban education, got my master's in the sociology of education, but always came back to the education of Black students. And so when it came time to apply for PhD programs, I really wanted to be in a place that not only focused on the studying of Black people, but coming from the perspective of Black people. And so that was really important to me. And I got to go back to my undergrad institution to get my PhD with other really great people who I was in McNair with. And I knew the professors. So it was it was a really good situation. But it also allowed me to combine all of these things that I was interested in. So Black language and education and hip hop studies at that point, all together under the umbrella of Black studies. And I think that's what keeps me committed, even when I've taught writing and rhetoric at various institutions. But even in that, I'm teaching it through a Black studies perspective, and centering what we learn from Black culture, Black life, Black language about how we communicate. Being able to incorporate all of those things and to take seriously the intellectual production of Black people is really important to me. How about you?
Yeah, I had a different path. I had done my PhD in post-World War II Jewish philosophy at University of Memphis, my dissertation advisor, this was, I always feel a little embarrassed by this, but he liked my dissertation. He made a phone call, said to an editor, you should publish this book. You should look at this manuscript. And I had a postdoc, finished the book, in this really short amount of time. And one of the things I wasn't prepared for out of graduate school was the second project. How do you define yourself as a scholar and teacher? And So I had a postdoc year at Florida Atlantic University where I basically sat around trying to figure out what my next project was. And I had initially wanted to work on questions of memory and trauma in cinema, cinema and poetry, in relation to the Holocaust. And that was folded into my dissertation project and so forth. And I had given a talk at the Catholic University of Lima on Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah. And afterwards, I just happened to be talking to this person, Salomon Lerner, who was the rector of the university. But I just was sitting next to him at the conference banquet, and he asked me about my research interests, and I told him memory, trauma, loss, how does life go on after catastrophe? And he turned to me and he said, he asked me some questions. Are you French? Are you European? And I was like, yeah, from born in Los Angeles, from the West Coast. Like, there's no such thing as these identities, like where, like European, like identities kind of go to die. And he was like asking that, and I thought he was just sort of being chatty. And then he said, if you don't have that investment in that place, why haven't you talked about? Why don't you use your gifts or, some sort of flowery praise to talk about the Americas? And he said, because the Americas, that word or those two words are synonymous with trauma and loss, conquest and enslavement. And then we went back to eating, and I talked to him some years later, and when I was working on a different project. And I was like, you changed my life with this. Like, I never thought, like, I had put these questions of trauma and loss at a distance. But now, like, I was compelled by this idea that you come back and, put this back at your, my front door, right? That this is in, where I live. And I just went back to my postdoc institution, and I went to the librarian and I said, I want to learn the Black intellectual tradition. This was my approach. I was a great books undergraduate, and my idea of like how you learn something is you go read the first stuff up to the contemporary. And I just had them had the person draw up this long list of books, and I just started reading and reinvented myself. Because I started reading this, I was like, this is some of the most compelling and interesting stuff I've ever read. And why have I not been introduced to this? And what can I actually say as a philosopher and critical theory scholar? How can I comment on these texts? Because I'm really much, I'm not much more. I'm entirely a textual commentator. But I just started reading and just redefined myself straight out of graduate school, which for anyone listening in graduate school or just a new professor, I wouldn't really recommend this. It was like I lived with vertigo, like professional vertigo for 15 years. It all worked out. But I know I've gone on a long time, but I just got really taken by Salomon's question about like, why do you put these things across the Atlantic world when they're right at your at your doorstep? And that got me reading. And then I started reading, and I said, I think I have actually a lot to say about this, and I think this stuff is immensely important. And I think that's what's kept me connected to the field as well, is this sense of, critical theory is such a minor part of Black studies, but it's a really important part. And this is like a scholarly contribution I can make. I share your sort of interest in language and cultural studies. And I just feel like those fields are so underdeveloped, not underdeveloped, but there's so much more to be said, not under anything. There's so much more to be said. But, you mentioned that you'd done work in sociology and education. So I'm curious, because I was educated both as an undergrad and as a doctoral student in a discipline, philosophy and English. I'm curious how you think about your own relationship to disciplines, because you've sort of done both, right? You've done sociology and education, but also education studies is interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, and then Black studies. So I'm really curious for someone like you who's got such deep schooling and training in multiple disciplines, how you think of yourself in relation to disciplines, and also how your commitment to Black studies as a field impacts that relationship to disciplinary work.
So that most times I really don't think about the disciplines separately. When I went from, so my undergrad is in international relations and public affairs. And when I went from that to kind of looking into more education issues and then sociology of education issues, what I saw were all the overlaps. I saw how all that there were the same ideas being talked about in different ways in these varying fields. And so I'm always looking at, okay, but we all agree that this is an issue. You're just talking about it from this perspective and citing these people, and they're talking about it from this perspective and citing those people, but it's still an issue that we all agree exists. And so for me, it's really seeing the intersections between the disciplines, more so like situating myself as being trained in sociology or being trained in education. And then because my cognate is urban education for my PhD, that's already a very like, I don't want to say borderlands, but that's, on the outskirts of more traditional understandings of education, and the ways in which the purpose of education and the ways that it should function. So I didn't see myself necessarily as an education person. I kind of saw myself as a Black studies person in education. And even in thinking, like with my master's, even in the topics that I chose to study and the perspective that I took on everything from Durkheim to Bordeaux, it was always like, okay, that's great, but can we talk about Black intellectual thought here? Like, why are we relying on this? And is this at all considering race? Is this at all thinking about the way that race operates in particular in the US? So it's always been Black studies at the center for me, and everything else is filtered through that.
Yeah. It's been interesting for me to, part of reinventing yourself as an intellectual, when you have, I was just a graduate student and a very early professor, but you have like an establishment, you establish some kind of professional presence and reputation, or, not reputation's too strong, but, friends, they sort of, saw me as a philosopher for, the entire 1990s of graduate school and young professor. And it's been interesting for me to navigate multidisciplinarity when there is that like presumption among so many people that I'm doing philosophy but sort of dabbling in Black studies. And really, for me, rather than as the way you were describing it, as like coming to this field already, of education studies, with the Black studies perspective, I was like coming to Black studies material with a philosophy perspective, but trying to both hold that a little bit for myself, because I think the philosophy's perspective is important. I mean, I'm not in a philosophy department. I haven't been since 2002. Which seems like not that long ago, but that's 22 years ago. Okay, it's a little shocking. But for me, it was really trying to just dissolve that philosopher identity and rediscover myself in Black studies material as Black studies material. But then Black studies scholars saying, well, this is a very philosophical intervention in this way, and so asking you that question and then thinking about it for myself, it feels like kind of unresolved for me. Like unresolved in the sense of I don't think I've dissolved my relationship as a philosopher as much as I would like to, but also wanting to hold on to that as a valuable way of framing and reframing. Because if you're looking for philosophy in the Black intellectual tradition, in the Atlantic world, it's rare that you find what professional philosophers would consider a philosophical text. So for me, it was like this crossroads. It's like either there is no philosophy in the Black intellectual tradition, or we have to think about what philosophy means, not on the institution of philosophy's own terms, but on the expressive life of Black people, historically and contemporary, and what are the philosophical dimensions of that. So it's like finding those philosophical dimensions as a reader. So like listening to you talk, it was sort of like almost like the inversion where you were saying like, we all agree this is a problem. Here's a Black studies perspective. And for me, it's like, here's these texts that have some wisdom in them and debates across multiple figures or time periods. How is that reckoned with philosophically? But I always worry about that, the place of discipline, language and work, and even for me, like comfort, which is a very private kind of thing. But I was just writing some stuff recently where I was talking about John Locke and Immanuel Kant, and I was like, oh, this other voice in me is like coming out. And it's not my like Black studies voice, it was my philosophy voice. And I was wondering, like, how do you create that kind of distance and attend to the demands that the field that you were trained in, right, expect?
I think it's difficult. Like, I don't think it's easy. And I definitely have been in situations where I know that I'm not sociology enough or education enough for it to be read in the discipline strictly. And so, as there is with being in academia as a whole, there's a lot of imposter syndrome and getting comfortable with, nah, that's just not me, right? Like, that's just not where I'm supposed to be. And that's okay. That's fine. I found the places that I was supposed to be. Ultimately, I made it to a Black Studies department, which was the goal. But really thinking about the kind of work that, like, this is what I want to do. And so I'm going to do this work. And that might mean different things for the opportunities that are available right now. But I think that being able to teach writing and rhetoric was really helpful in not only thinking about that, but also being able to really hone in on that, like the education part of it, right? So it's not just like, let's study education, but what do we do? Like, how do we educate? And I think that was not only very connected to the purpose of Black studies as a whole, but also in being intentional about how maybe we shift the perspectives of other people, of students, regarding what work can look like and what's considered valid knowledge and where we can gain lessons from.
So thinking about like teaching composition and rhetoric, I'm interested how as a teacher and scholar both, how the history and future of the field of Black studies impacts your approach, right? So in this case, like, you're talking about composition, writing and composition, and that's a general education course. It's never a Black studies specific course, although it's really interesting to think what that would mean to locate it in our department. But I'm wondering how like Black studies as a field bears like the past and the future of the field, or just the field, and its methods, how it impacts that kind of classroom for you, any classroom. But that one is particularly interesting to me because that's entering a space where people don't expect Black studies, and then a Black studies PhD is in there teaching it. So I'm curious how that's worked for you and sort of how you've moved through teaching writing and composition with your PhD.
It was fun for the most part, honestly. It was different depending upon the type of institution that I was at, public versus private versus religious, in the way that it was received. I think because it is a gen ed course, students have to be there and they don't necessarily want to be there. Very few students are like, oh yeah, I have a comp class. That's just kind of, it's like a logic class or something. Everybody's a little like. So one of my main goals was to like make it engaging, to make it a space that students didn't hate to come to, which was one of the things that I like concluded from my dissertation about classroom spaces. But, I think that being able to engage with not just Black writing and Black writers, most of the sources that we read were Black people, but also to incorporate Black culture. And students really liked the cultural elements and being able to see that, like, yeah, writing is structure, sentence structure, and paragraph development and form, but it's also style. And so really emphasizing the style aspect of it, which I don't think you can talk about style without talking about Black people in the US.
Yeah.
And so having that be a main element was really helpful. And students enjoyed being able to do that. And also like giving them the opportunity to think about what they're interested in and how you can write about and communicate about what you're interested in various ways. Like, how are you going to effectively communicate this to different audiences? So focusing on audience, focusing on style, were really two of the main things that I learned from studying Black rhetorics, and all of the amazing professors that I was trained by in the Black rhetorical tradition. That's really how I came to it.
Yeah, it's, one of the things I was thinking about with this question also for you was, when you teach a Black Studies course, the students come in and they largely expect, although this may be part of being a white professor or some of my titles that use words like existentialism, students, by and large, expect, that all the material would be, by Black people, about Black people. So in that way, I mean, in my experience, there's been very little resistance to the idea of sort of centering traditions or even just taking a heavy emphasis on the study of Black life. When I was in a philosophy department and doing this sort of thing, which was the first 4 or 5 years of my full-time professorships, students reacted so differently to the introduction of that material. I'm curious, like, in rhetoric and composition, if the Black Studies approach, if it created that sort of extra level of work, or if students are just excited to, as you said, this question of style. I really like that, by the way. You can't talk, if writing is a question of style, you can't talk about style in the U.S. without African Americans. That's great. That should be like a slogan for writing programs, actually, who take this stuff seriously. But that shift then between teaching Black Studies in a composition classroom and teaching Black Studies in a Black Studies classroom, how your approach maybe felt same or different.
So it's definitely different. One, because there's not as much writing involved, right? Like teaching writing, every assignment is writing. I'm constantly reading students' writing. They're constantly drafting. It's a different structure to the course, which can be good and bad. It takes a lot of time to repeatedly have drafts and give the type of feedback that's helpful in a writing course. But I also think that, writing is one of the ways that you can see students' thought process that's not necessarily as evident in a midterm or a final exam that's multiple choice questions. So that part was a little different. I think it has allowed me to not have to, I am not bound by making sure the student walks out with certain writing skills anymore. It still drives me a little crazy if they don't, but like that's not the purpose of the class anymore. So we're able to get into things that don't have to necessarily be reflected in their writing in the way that it did before. And it allows for more general conversation, I think, to happen around the topics themselves without, now let's talk about like, what does this mean for our communication practices? I still have a lot of rhetoric in my classes, and I still kind of frame all of my classes around how we think about these ideas, how these ideas are presented, how people talk about Black culture and Black people and what that means for our understanding. And having students think about what they know about Black people and Black culture and why. So the education part of it is still really important to me. But I get to include things that would not have been as easily adaptable to a writing course. I watch a lot more documentaries now. And we're able to do activities that don't come back to writing skills and making sure you can put together sentences.
Yeah, because I know one of your interests is what, that's the question, what is a Black Studies pedagogy? And so that's something I haven't thought a lot about. I've been thinking about it. I know you gave a talk last week about it. But I've been thinking myself, like, what do I think of as a Black Studies pedagogy? I actually hadn't thought about it in those terms, even though I've been pedagoging in a Black Studies classroom for a long time. I mean, how does it shift in the Black Studies classroom versus the composition classroom? And also how you think. I'm curious to hear you talk about how you think about Black Studies pedagogy.
So I think it's complicated. And so my question, like that talk really was more about having a discussion. Like, so what is a Black Studies pedagogy and how do people view that differently? Because I don't think it necessarily has to be a set of predefined things that happen, right? But I do think that there is an approach and a framing to a Black Studies classroom that probably should exist and probably should be expected, no matter what institution you're at, to have a certain orientation. But I think because so many professors in Black Studies departments do not have degrees in Black Studies, I also wonder, like, what does that mean for the influence of the disciplinary understanding of these ideas rather than one that's rooted in the field of Black Studies, and if that makes a difference. I also think that usually teaching is not the main thing for most professors at R1s. So I'm curious as to how many pedagogical conversations are happening. Are we talking more about the research, which, yes, and the grants and doing all of the projects that are very important. But what does that mean for what happens in the classroom? And whether or not we're intentional about hoping our students leave with something other than their grade.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's my fourth year at an R1 after many years at a teaching college. I mean, it was research forward, but, emphasis on students. I love teaching undergraduates. I just never felt like a conflict, and I miss undergraduates, when I'm not doing it. But when the pedagogy question for me, and just thinking about this, the question I asked you about relating to disciplines, and really for me, how is a Black Studies classroom and Black Studies scholarship different? In the classroom, a thing that, it's gotten so habitual for me now, I forget that there was a learning curve for me, which is coming in and students being feeling like they already know the answer to the question of the course because they're Black, as if this was a course to educate, how to be Black. That I used to actually teach the Baratunde Thurston book, How to Be Black. I don't know if you. I also used to when I taught that. This is a tangent, but when I used to teach that book, I would ask students to go to a coffee shop or some cafe or something and read in public, and talk about like the way people looked at them. Because I would prep for class reading it, and the looks were amazing. But I think that my experience has been a lot of negotiating in those first couple of weeks, especially at the more introductory level, that supposition that students have that they already know how to be Black and they don't need this class to tell them that. And then discovering that the things that they were interested in their other courses, right? What is the human person? How ought we live? What is justice? what do we make of our personal memories in relation to collective memories and national memories? All these things they were doing over there, all of a sudden there's all this material that focus those questions on the lives and traditions of, either black diasporic or African or mixture of all of those. And so for me, that question of, Black studies pedagogy is in some ways just the reminder to students, which is always shocking to me how much of a shock it is, that these things that they read in other classes, there's material in the Black intellectual tradition on those same topics. And they can either be very excited by that or a little shocked. And, I always feel like they're about to go home and like yell at their K through 12 teachers for not exploring that. And for me, that how to teach in one course film, poetry, literature, the personal essay, documentary, fiction film, short story, like to mix all of those things into one classroom is so strange. I think that people who do Black studies from a disciplinary perspective, I think they do the field a disservice, or not a disservice, but they don't honor the field as much as they could and explore its richness. But I'm also like, it's such a simpler approach. I mean, I feel like I have to be a different person if I'm like teaching like a Donnicott short story one week and then a Du Bois essay another week and like something from Mariah Stewart or David Walker, these epistles or rhetorical, speeches where you have to talk about rhetoric and persuasion and then crafting film shots. And it's just, I love that. It's a vitality, but the level of preparation, I think we don't appreciate often how much work that is. I think when we're doing it, we appreciate it. But as academia, what's required of you in area studies is a whole different kind of level of preparation and competency.
Yeah.
I was just thinking when you listed your interests, you're like education, urban education and policy, hip hop scholarship, history of Black intellectual thought. I mean, that's a lot of different stuff right there.
Yeah. I'm all over the place, but I feel like it works.
We all are. This is good. This is good, though. I mean, it means you can't really be bored. But, you have your PhD in Black studies, and so I'm curious, like, how you think, sort of coming out of that education and out of that tradition, how you think about the past of Black studies. Like, what interests you about it? It's 50-something, 52, 53 years old at this point. I have 54 years, I guess, now. It's, over a half century old, so it has a real history. I'm curious to hear you talk about what interests you about its past and, whether it's like what excites you about its past, or what you feel deep criticism of and therefore sort of galvanized to address.
I think that the founding of Black studies is very powerful, right? The demand for this to exist, for students to say this is something that the university has to give us because the university is flawed. I think that is really powerful. And I think that moment where you had a bunch of Black studies programs and departments being born was probably a very interesting moment to have lived through and to be in. And then you had a bunch of Black studies departments go away. And so this temporary high and abundance that then has now shifted and is not as it once was. I mean, I think there are 13 PhD granting Black studies departments in the country. It's not that many places you can do this as a profession for real.
Yeah.
And there were more in 1980. It makes me think about the cycles of history, and how the more things change, the more they remain the same, and whether or not the master's tools can ever dismantle the master's house. And, whether or not as a field we failed because you don't have that element that's pushing the institution to the same degree anymore. But you're fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts. You have many Black Studies departments that are chronically underfunded and undersupported, and primarily service departments, and you have a lack of value for the kind of work that happens, not just in Black Studies, but in ethnic studies programs and departments across the board. We have current political pushing to not take seriously actual history or ethnic studies at all. You have the increasing cost of college, which is making it not attainable or only attainable with massive amounts of lifelong debt. Like, I think that there's so much going on that the context that it started is not the context that we're in now. And I wonder, like, what lessons can be taken from how it started to addressing all of the things that are happening now. And if this is another third thing, like, it's not what it was before there were Black Studies departments. It's not what the original goal of Black Studies departments was. What is the third thing that we're in now, and what does that mean for where we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot with the, in 2020, a lot of institutions, and so some Black Studies departments, but often disciplinary departments that were, interested in Black life, had this surge of hiring, because of the George Floyd protests, the protests of the murder of George Floyd. And I remember thinking, and I've said it many times, this is one of the few things I proselytize about in my classes, is I try to get them to think about the fact that they're in a classroom that's made possible by student protesters, and that it's not just like it was a strongly worded Google Doc. I mean, these were students who risked professional ostracization. They certainly risked their careers at institutions in order to get this established. But also that maybe one of the things we ought to think about is how it seems like the only thing that is pushing Black Studies forward in terms of institutional support is the murder of Black people. And that's just wrong. Like, I don't have fancy words for it, but we can't turn the future of Black Studies into some sort of necro-political contest of like, well, there's this murder, so can we have a professorship, But it's also kind of where, as you said, that question of like, what's the next thing? Like, what's our next way of demanding our presence? And it seems like until we have an answer to that or a coherent response to it, we're in a little bit of an obscene situation of our growth coming from death. And that I'm not saying that departments should somehow not try to expand, right, in these situations, but it's certainly, I think we ought to reflect on that. Like, not we, but institutions ought to reflect on that. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it in that framing, that the growth is coming from death. That's just, like you said, that's just wrong.
And there's such joy in the founding of Black Studies. I mean, it's protest and risk and everything, but it's like finally, like, we have a foothold in something that's really important. I mean, it's, academia is, whatever petty, weird, strange profession or whatever, but higher education is where people come to develop as people. And so, like, having a foothold in higher education is just so important. Like, where is our voice that way? Because I'm interested too. I mean, my own orientation as a critical theorist is theoretical. I'm interested in theoretical issues. You can call it philosophical issues if you want. I'm interested in expressive culture and art and literature. But I do feel like the past of Black Studies as being founded in protest, I do ask myself that all the time, and I think that we professors in Black Studies ought to always ask ourselves that, like, what is my relationship to the sort of ancestors of the field, right? Not the professor ancestors, but the activist ancestors. Like, what would they say about what we're doing? Not that they're the final judge and we ought to obey or follow, but what questions would they ask? I think for my own, this is really teaching more than research, because it's a whole specialty I haven't taken on. But I just think, like, those protesters who created Black Studies, what would they say to me if I was just completely ignorant and acted like the racialized mass incarceration, acting as if that didn't exist as a teacher, right? I mean, that hung in my conscience for a while. I started teaching a class because I felt like what interests me about the history or the past of Black Studies, what excites me, but also works critically in relation to me, was that moment of, like, what would they say, right? They were addressing segregation. They were addressing exclusion at the most radical, basic levels, right? What does it mean for me to not think about our contemporary iterations of the same things? And that, for me, is the way the founding works, as like a conscience almost. And that's also where I feel that conscience in those moments of, like, our only point forward seems to be death. I think those activists, if we were talking with them, would just be like, don't you have a different vision? Like, can't we be better than that? It's like women and gender studies, like, maybe this post-Dobbs decision, they begin expanding because there's an urgency, but, like, women's studies has always been about, like, Black Studies has always been about more than these, trying to scramble to preserve some remnant of life in the midst of a crisis. Mm-hmm. Hopefully it's something bigger than that. But thinking about the past, right? And there's the past, but it's, at this point, after a half century plus, it's a tradition, right? An intellectual and academic tradition. I'm curious, in the other direction, what is it about the sort of emerging futures and new things in Black Studies that you find most exciting?
And the possibilities, the fact that Black Studies can and does go everywhere and touch everything, that it is exciting and overwhelming to think of how it's going to interpret and influence and consider what's happening now technologically, socially, politically, economically. Like, I'm excited about the ability to be able to think about these things, even, 50 years since the founding, and removed from some of, like, the intellectual tradition, right? Like, we're talking about Du Bois, and you're talking about Woodson and Malcolm X, and thinking about, like, being hundreds, 50, 60, 100, 150 years removed from when they were doing a lot of their writing, and all of it still being so relevant. Like, I think that the timelessness of the lessons and the frameworks and the understandings is, on the one hand, sad, but I think it's also really helpful, and it gives us a way to think about where we can go next and what we can do to respond to a moment politically that is probably more like 50, 60 years ago than we would have thought it would be.
Jesus. Yeah, no. That is not a pleasant realization, but it is absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, for me, thinking about the future, I like what you said about the, future, innovations in the field do make us reread the past in really important ways. And I love that. I think that's what traditions do when they're traditions, is they're innovations, and then older scholars get mad about the innovation. That's not how we did things. And those conflicts are great, and hopefully people are respectful, but also a little bit of audacity is a good thing. But opening up those new horizons, when we work in sort of productively across generations, I just think, like, the way that questions of sexuality and queerness have become such an important part of Black studies in the last decade. I mean, I know it predates that, but really becoming a prominent part of the field. The way it does make you go back and reread figures. I think that, Ernest Gibson's book, Salvific Manhood, on James Baldwin, is a book that could really only be written from a Black studies perspective in the midst of or in the wake of queer theory making a serious intervention. And I'm like, it's one of my favorite books. So if Ernest listens to this, I love your book. And, the way the figures of the past start to look different, I think is really important because that keeps us from calcifying the past. Of, this is what Du Bois said, and this is what Baldwin said, and this is what Hurston said, and this is what Hansberry said. But instead thinking about them differently, they just get reframed, and it gives new life. I mean, that happens in all kinds of European traditions, the way the past gets reread. But I think emerging also for me, and Angela Davis is such a key figure in this, is thinking about productively, but I would also like to think self-critically about cross-racial, cross-national, cross-ethnic solidarities, but also mutual critique. I think, in this particular moment, there is like a whole, way of talking about Black solidarity with Palestine, with Palestinians. Angela Davis was talking about that 20-something years ago about both, we should think about this, but also about how it might make us think differently about Black studies when we start to think about it in relation to these things. And I think most intimately, in terms of the United States, what it means to think African American studies in relation to Indigenous studies. I've had this, finishing up this book on James Baldwin, and it's really about James Baldwin's conception of home. And he says, my ancestors, their blood is in this earth. We have a right to this place. And I was very confidently sort of finishing this, and then I stopped, and I was like, well, the intersection of African American studies and Indigenous studies, he's making a land claim on conquered land. And that's what I mean by that moment of self-criticism. And, I have a long footnote. Nobody reads footnotes, but it did just that moment of self-criticism and reframing for me so much of the rhetoric of the African American tradition that often focuses around land and home and rights to place. All of a sudden, Indigenous studies, those points of contact, which are just really fresh and new, they're productive and wonderful and enriching. But I'm also interested in those moments where they stop us as scholars and teachers in our tracks. That moment where we may be using some of this language in the classroom, and an Indigenous student or somebody who's done Indigenous studies is like, well, you're talking about conquered land. How do you just make this assertion? And I don't know how to think through that, I don't know how to think about African-American solidarity or with Palestinian struggle, but also the way African-Americans are a part of an imperial state in that particular place, and what does solidarity mean in these fraught political situations. And I like those critical questions, but they're super anxiety producing. But that's the future. The future is not supposed to be for me anyway, the future is never supposed to be about that thing that affirms what we've always been. It's always going to introduce new questions. And sometimes it's really fun because you get to reinterpret people. Sometimes it's not fun because you get your presuppositions exposed, right? But I like that about the future of Black studies. I think that as loath as I am to praise young people as an emerging old man. I want to be a cranky old man, but I love young people's audacity and boundary pushing because of how it makes me question myself, both as a scholar and a teacher. I don't know if you've had these kinds of, they're like intrusive thoughts, but they're actually rooted in really real stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And you're right that ability to self-critique, the living memory portion of it is really important. And that's something I talk about in Black Studies courses and in writing courses. But Aisha Durham has the book Home with Hip Hop Feminism, and she talks about this idea of textual expression, like marrying living memory to research, and how research and ideas in the past changes over time, and your memories of the past and your understanding of the past changes over time. And what does it mean to think about how these things are not static, like they move and they change as they should, and how are they moving and changing given the new information and understandings and theories and revelations that we have today versus what was available before, and what will we know tomorrow?
That's the what will we know tomorrow is probably my biggest hesitation around any publication. I'm like, what new discovery will make me the target of severe critique, long after I have passed? But that's what it means to join a tradition, right? It's not just joining a tradition and being, feeling the warm embrace, but also feeling that moment of vulnerability, because who knows how people will read what we said, Yeah.
That's the this is so unrelated, but there's it reminds me of the quote in Men in Black where Tommy Lee Jones is telling Will Smith, like, yesterday you knew you were alone on this planet, right? Today you know that's not the case. Imagine what you're actually going to know tomorrow. Like, yesterday we thought one thing was true. Today you know it's not. Okay, so what's going to happen tomorrow? I always say that. I say that to my sister when she's stressed out about her work. It's like, girl, it's fine. Tomorrow, we're going to know something else. It's all good.
It might be more stressful than today. Today will look like peace. Or maybe everything will be resolved. All right. Well, this was great. I'm really happy to get this podcast series started off with a conversation between the two of us. I'm going to go over and confirm the title of that book, because the living memory and research part is super interesting to me. That's the thing about these conversations. It's like we're across the hall. We see each other all the time. I didn't know about that book. You never mentioned it. I never asked about it. So there we go. Already more to read. But good to talk, and have a great rest of the day.
You too.
All right, take care.
Bye.